Mr. Engel of New York also for his efforts to bring this bill up today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back. All time for debate has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3509? Those in favor say aye. 3509 is amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds of those having voted in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Couldn't tell whether
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 438, I call up House Joint Resolution 59 with a House amendment to the Senate amendment thereto and a motion I have at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution, designate the Senate amendment, and designate the motion.
House Joint Resolution 59, joint resolution making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes. Senate amendment. Motion offered by Mr. Ryan of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 438, the motion shall be debatable for 70 minutes, with 60 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Budget, and 10 minutes equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, will each control 30 minutes. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, will each control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on further consideration of House Joint Resolution 59.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I rise on behalf of the bipartisan budget agreement. This is the first time since 1986 that a divided Congress has done what we are about to do. Here's what the bill does. It reduces the deficit by $23 billion. It does not raise taxes, and it cuts spending in a smarter way. We take temporary, across-the-board cuts, and we replace them with targeted, permanent reforms. And these reforms, they take place immediately. First, we cut waste. For instance, we stop paying Medicaid bills that deadbeat dads ought to cover. We stop sending unemployment checks to criminals. Second, we go after corporate welfare. We eliminated a government program for energy companies. We eliminated a special carve-out in the student loan program. Third, we start to address the real problem, and that is autopilot spending. We ask new federal employees to contribute a little bit more toward their retirement. We asked private companies to cover a little bit more of their own pension guarantees. These savings build up over time. And this bill saves more than if we did nothing. This bill isn't as far as I'd like. It's not near the breadth and the scope of the budget that we passed earlier. But that's how it works in divided government. That's the nature of compromise. In a divided government, you don't get everything you want. But I think this bill is a firm step in the right direction. It's not perfect. It's a start. That's how it works in divided government. I also think, Mr. Speaker, it gives us the added benefit of preventing Washington from this lurch from crisis to crisis. We're bringing stability to the budget process. And that stability will help build confidence, and that confidence will help our economy. I'll be the first to admit we have a lot more work to do. I've been bringing budgets to this floor for 5 years that balance the budget, that pay off the debt, that reform our entitlement programs. That's what we want to do. That's what we are going to keep working on doing. But in this divided government, we're going to take the steps we can take, and this step we think is one in the right direction. We need to help strengthen the economy. We need to help create jobs and in take-home pay. The bottom line is, this first step is designed to help improve people's lives. It's designed to make this government work at a basic functioning level. And by passing this, we will reduce the deficit. We came here to get something done. We always lock horns. We always argue. We never agree. I think it's about time, for once in a long time, we find common ground and agree. And that is what this bill does. And that is what I asked my colleagues to consider and support this agreement. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by commending my friend and colleague, Chairman Ryan, for working on this bipartisan agreement. And I also want to congratulate our Senate colleague, Senator Patty Murray, Chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, for her efforts to get this done, along with many of our colleagues. This agreement is far from perfect. It is not the budget agreement I or many of my colleagues would have written. But I do believe that on balance, at the margin, it represents a small but positive step forward. Mr. Speaker, I would not have been able to say that as recently as this past Monday and early Tuesday, but as a result of changes made, I think this is a positive step forward. And I want to commend my fellow conferees in the House side, Mr. Clyburn and Ms. Lowy, as well as the efforts of Leader Pelosi to make the changes necessary. As a result of those changes, this is an agreement that many of our colleagues can now support. And that is for many reasons. But most of all, it results in a situation where we will avoid the very deep and harmful cuts from the sequester, which, if this Congress does not act, will automatically take effect a few weeks from now. And those very deep and unproductive across-the-board cuts will create an unnecessary drag on the economy at a time when economic growth is building but still not nearly where it is. It will have a negative impact on job growth, and it will eat away at important national priorities and investments. As a result of this agreement, in fiscal year 2014, we will be able to invest $25 billion more in vital national areas than we were in fiscal year 2013. Of those $25 billion investments, $22.5 billion will be in important areas of domestic investment, in areas of education, in areas of important scientific research like medical research at the National Institutes of Health. It will also provide, as Chairman Ryan has said, some certainty, which is very important at this point in time. And without this agreement, you would be guaranteed additional furloughs of federal employees in the coming year. So I think it is a positive step forward. I do, Mr. Speaker, want to express my extreme disappointment in one area. The agreement itself, as Chairman Ryan has acknowledged and Senator Murray recognized, decided not to include what we call the doc fix, and it decided we would not include unemployment insurance compensation extension. Many of us argued that we should include both of those in this agreement. In fact, House Democrats proposed an agreement along those lines. We believe that if we're going to do the doc fix, which we think is important, making sure that doctors who provide services to Medicare patients are fully compensated, we should also make sure that individuals who are on long-term unemployment will not be left out in the cold 3 days after Christmas. It was decided that those elements would not be in the agreement itself, and yet last night at the 11th hour, the House Republican majority decided to insert the doc fix within this agreement. We support that doc fix, but we are very troubled that we've not even been allowed a vote to extend unemployment compensation. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is even without that, if we leave here without this agreement, we're not going to get extension of unemployment insurance because the Speaker won't allow us to have a vote on that. So the only thing we would accomplish by defeating this budget agreement would be to go home with a lot of uncertainty and with the sequester guaranteed to hit in January. That is not a good result. This agreement is a better result. I'll talk a little bit later about what we believe we should be doing in this Congress. As the Chairman said, this agreement doesn't match his vision, nor does it match ours. And we put forward a proposal that would focus a lot more on job creation, to try and invest more in our national infrastructure, in our roads and our bridges and our broadband, so that we can put people back to work right now and accomplish important national priorities. We believe we should be focusing on early education, investing more in our future so we have job growth not only now from additional investments, but we ensure greater job growth in the future. There are other things that we think were important and part of this agreement, which are not in here, but we will continue to fight for in the days ahead. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Rogers from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. H.J. 59, the Ryan-Murray budget agreement. First, I want to commend Chairman Ryan on achieving a resolution to our immediate budget challenges. It takes a good deal of courage. It takes persistence. It takes dedication to reach a bipartisan agreement such as this. And I want the chairman of the Budget Committee to know that we deeply appreciate his hard work on our behalf. Great job. While everyone might not like everything in this bill, it is the best product that is achievable right now, and I urge that it be passed. As our budget chairman has said, this agreement reflects a compromise in policies, but not in our conservative principles. Not only does this deal hold the line on spending, it actually puts a dent in our annual deficit, a very significant accomplishment. Plus, it opens the door for future progress on the problem of runaway entitlements and paves the way toward budget and economic stability for the next 2 years. The legislation before us will also accomplish several other critically important goals. First and foremost, it will turn off the potentially devastating $20 billion sequestration cut to our national defense. Even if Congress provided what flexibility we could, which isn't much, a cut of this magnitude would cripple readiness programs and leave us all at risk. Second, this bill will allow Congress to avoid another shutdown showdown and help us return to regular order. As I've said many, many times before, the best way to trim spending, ensure wise investments of taxpayer dollars, and provide stability for our government and our economy is to do appropriations bills on an annual basis, each one separately brought to the floor, as the Constitution intends. This budget conference agreement will now permit bicameral negotiations on the fiscal year 2014 appropriations bills to begin, allowing my committee to get to work and make the hard, thoughtful, responsible, line-by-line funding decisions that are Congress's duty to make. It's important to remember that this is just the first step in the current budget process. My committee will now begin to negotiate and craft an omnibus appropriations bill that will fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year with the goal of completing it before the end of the CR January 15th. The omnibus will reflect the budget outline that is the Ryan Murray bill before us now and will make the hard choices to implement this budget agreement into actual funding levels. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill. It makes a significant first step to putting us on a more stable and responsible fiscal path. Again, I want to commend the chairman, the ranking member, and all the members of the conference committee for the hard work, difficult decisions that they had to make to bring this bill to us now. I urge our colleagues to support it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to my colleague, friend, and the gentlelady from Maryland on the Transportation Committee, Ms. Edwards.
Gentlelady from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Maryland, my friend and my colleague, for all of your work in getting us to this point. To my friend also, Chairman Ryan, for getting us to this point, and to all the conferees. I am in support of the Bipartisan Budget Act. Though I support the agreement, it isn't the bill that I would have written. It's not the bill that I would have written to fully protect federal employees, today's employees and future employees. It's not the bill that I would have written to protect 1.3 million Americans who are about to lose their emergency unemployment insurance, 22,900 of them in Maryland just at the holidays. It's not the bill that I would have written that would reduce cost of living adjustments for our nation's military retirees. It's not the bill that I would have written to protect the commuter tax credit. But you know what? I didn't write this legislation, Mr. Speaker. It's a compromise. It's a negotiation. It's not perfect, but I support it. The agreement does ensure that federal employees, current federal employees, will get their cost of living increases this year. They won't face the uncertainties of furloughs, and they will face stability for the next couple of years. This compromise rejects the draconian proposal in the chairman's budget that would have made federal employees pay 5.5% more for their retirement at a cost of $20 billion, but that's not in this bill. This agreement does roll back sequestration cuts using spending cuts and new revenue. And the agreement increases non-defense discretionary spending by replacing almost 2/3 of this year's cuts, bringing the funding to $77 billion above the Republicans' preferred budget levels. The agreement doesn't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid benefits, not by a single penny. What the agreement does is it allows Congress and this nation to get out of the dysfunction and the obstruction and to get on to the other business of protecting the American people, perhaps allowing us to focus on unemployment insurance extension, immigration, infrastructure investment, and all of the things that it takes to protect our economy. I support this legislation. Let's get on with it. And with that, I yield.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
I will give myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, just so that my colleagues understand what exactly this bill does or does not do, I want to walk you through a chart. In 2011, Congress passed the Budget Control Act. That set discretionary spending at this level up here, the blue line. It said that this thing we commonly call the super committee was supposed to go and cut $1.2 trillion out of mandatory spending, autopilot spending, the non-discretionary part of the budget, the big, fast-growing part that Congress rarely addresses. And if it didn't happen, then the sequester would kick in. That's this red line. That's where we are now because the sequester has kicked in. And what we face in January is another round of sequester cuts, $20 billion, that hits solely on defense spending in the military. A lot of us are concerned about that. When we have 85% of our troops, our brigades, are not ready, that's a problem. When we have people in Afghanistan and we need to reset our equipment and we're not where we need to be, that's a problem. That's a concern of ours. But what we do not want to do is lose any of the fiscal progress that was made by this act. In fact, we want to go farther. So what this bill does is it says for this rest of this half fiscal year 2014, and the upcoming fiscal year 2015, it changes discretionary spending to go to $1,012 billion and then $1,014 billion back on to where we are with the sequester. Okay, what does all that mean? It means that 92% of the sequester is still intact. For the next year and a half, this bill preserves 70% of the sequester, but we pay for that 30% that is given back. Let me explain what that means just in a quick dollars and cents sense. This bill achieves $85 billion in mandatory savings, the things we talked about a minute ago, all those various permanent spending cuts. It gives back or relieves from the sequester $63 billion in spending, half to defense, half to domestic spending like Mr. Van Hollen was talking about. The result is a net deficit reduction of $23 billion. So from the Budget Control Act of 2011, this advances fiscal responsibility to the tune of $23 billion. To put it this way, another way, 2 years ago when we passed the first House Republican budget, when we came into the majority, the appropriation number we were looking for then was $1,019 billion. Then in 2012, in the next House Republican budget, the appropriation bill we were fighting for then was $1,028 billion. Giving myself another minute to explain.
Gentleman is recognized for one additional minute.
The Budget Control Act would have had us at $1,058 billion. This agreement puts us at $1,012 billion. Under this agreement, we would not hit that discretionary spending number of $1,019 billion, the one we asked for 2 years ago. We wouldn't hit that number until the year 2017. So with respect to a fiscal track record, we're ahead of schedule. And we are replacing some of these across-the-board spending cuts that are indiscriminate, that don't set priorities, that treat the efficient and inefficient programs the same, with smarter permanent spending cuts in the autopilot part of spending, that part that Congress all too often ignores. Mr. Speaker, this is good government. It's also divided government. And under divided government, we need to take steps in the right direction. And to make divided government work, you can't ask each other to compromise a core principle, because we don't do that here. We ask each other to find some common ground to advance the common good, and that's what this agreement does, and that is why I ask my colleagues to support it. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this agreement is an acknowledgement, at least a majority on both sides, certainly on the Democratic side, a strong majority, that the sequester is a dumb and unproductive way to cut spending or to reduce the deficit. What this agreement does is prevent that full sequester from taking place over the next 2 years. We believe that we should address and substitute the remaining sequester through a balanced approach of additional targeted cuts. But, Mr. Speaker, we also think we should close some of these special interest tax loopholes that benefit nobody except certain narrow interests that sometimes have undue sway here in the Congress. But as my colleague said, we have different approaches, and our Republican colleagues have refused to close a single one of those special tax breaks or preferences for the purpose either of reducing the sequester or reducing the deficit. So we have different approaches. We wouldn't have chosen the offsets that are in here to pay for the sequester replacement. They are the result of a negotiation. But as I said earlier, I believe on balance this is an important step forward, and one of the people who was very important in this process was my good friend and colleague from New York, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee and one of the conferees, Ms. Lowy.
How much time?
2 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the budget deal is a breakthrough in a difficult budget year and a dysfunctional Congress. As with any compromise, there are elements I oppose, yet this agreement should help us do our jobs for the American people and end the shutdown standoffs. It provides some relief from the devastating impact of the sequester cuts on our economy and American families. Keeping sequestration in place through fiscal year 2014 would cost up to an estimated 1.6 million jobs. Now, the House and Senate must restore regular order to craft bills that instead create new jobs and protect important priorities like medical research, security and infrastructure upgrades, and early education. This agreement restores over 60% of the sequester on non-defense discretionary spending in 2014, restores those bills to roughly the FY 2013 enacted pre-sequester levels. It would hold defense funding levels roughly consistent with the 2013 level after sequester. The bill before us includes elements, frankly, I don't like, fails to address others it should. First, I am deeply upset that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle insisted on extending the 2% sequester on Medicare providers for an additional 2 years as part of the package's offsets. We should not extend their sequester burden. It is also unconscionable that the deal does not extend long-term unemployment benefits. Even with the progress our economy has made since the depths of the recession, there are still 1.3 million fewer jobs today than 6 years ago. 4 million Americans have been looking for work for more than 6 months. More than 1.3 million of them, 30 seconds.
I yield the gentlelady another 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
More than 1.3 million of them will lose their benefits, and for some, the only income they have, just 3 days after Christmas and 3 days before the new year. Today's bill will provide some economic certainty about fiscal policy over the next 2 years, which should boost growth and job creation. Because we cannot continue lurching from crisis to crisis, and despite my misgivings about the extension of Medicare provider cuts and failure to address long-term unemployment, I will vote yes.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Latham, for the purposes of a colloquy.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will yield the 2 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to enter into a colloquy with the gentleman from Wisconsin regarding the not-for-profit student loan servicing provisions in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. Is it your understanding and intent that the not-for-profit servicing provision in this act does not require the termination of existing federal loan servicing contracts of any not-for-profit services who are currently servicing federal loans? And is it the further understanding and intent of the gentleman from Wisconsin that the Education Department will continue to enter into contracts with not-for-profit servicers based on their performance?
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Yes, it is the legislative intent that existing contracts to use the services for not-for-profit services are not terminated by this bill, and that they will be permitted to compete with the Department of Education's Title IV services for additional accounts. I yield back to the colleague.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from Iowa.
I rise to associate myself with the comments of the managers, and am pleased to note it is their intent that the use of non-for-profit servicers continues, and that not-for-profit servicers will be permitted to compete in the future for additional accounts. And I yield back to the gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank the gentleman. I also rise to associate myself with the comments of the managers, and am pleased to know it is their intent that the use of not-for-profit servicers continues and that not-for-profit servicers will be permitted to compete in the future for additional accounts. And I yield back to my colleague from Vermont.
And I yield the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to a good friend and colleague, one of the conferees who worked with us to move this agreement to a place where it was supported by many of us on the Democratic side, the Assistant Democratic Leader, Mr. Clyburn.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me thank my friend, Mr. Van Hollen, for yielding me this time, and I want to thank him and Ms. Nita Lowry for the tremendous work they did in keeping this effort moving forward in a very positive way. I also want to thank Chairman Ryan for the great work he has done on this and the manner within which he got his work done. We don't talk a whole lot on this side of the Capitol about the other side, but I also want to thank Senator Patty Murray for all of her work. I had the great privilege of working with her on the Super Committee, and we didn't get much done. I was on the so-called Biden group along with Mr. Van Houten, and we didn't get anything done. But I'm pleased at this time of year to say that the third time seems to be the charm. This is not the product that I would have written if I were writing it, and I'm sure that it's not the product that any of my Democratic colleagues would write. I'm always concerned about the Meat Act's approach to dealing with the budget. And so this effort takes that away and allows us to approach spending in a way that is much more conducive to running the government. We didn't get everything, and nobody gets everything they want in trying to reach common ground. But it's important for me to note at this time some things that were taken off the table. There are no cuts to Social Security. There are no benefit cuts to those on receiving Medicare or Medicaid. And there's no targeting of federal employees for additional cuts. And the relief from the sequester in both defense and essential services is very real and significant. It's also important to note what this bill does not do. And I am very concerned about the fact that we were not able to make unemployment insurance a part of this effort.
I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds.
Thank you. I am hopeful that when we get back here after the first of the year, that we will move and do as we have done in the past. Pass unemployment insurance, make it retroactive to January 1, so those people who find themselves unemployed for no fault of their own can find some relief going into the next holiday season. So, and thanks. Hopefully we'll do something on the minimum wage. These are things that I think we need to do coming back here after the first of the year. And I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
First, I'd like to yield myself 30 seconds just to respond to my friend South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn. I want him to know that his time spent on these prior endeavors, the Biden group, all those, that was not time wasted. That was productive time, because the findings from those groups were used in this agreement. The work that they did on all of those policies were work that we borrowed from to put this together. So I want him to know that that was productive use of his time, which helped in turn produce this result.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to our distinguished Majority Whip, Mr. McCarthy from California.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to thank our chairman of the Budget Committee for showing the leadership, finding the common ground, but actually moving this entire House. When I first came to Congress, the debate was always about more spending, always about what would the future hold. Ever since the Republicans took the majority, within our first 4 months, we produced a budget that put us onto a path of a much different approach. That was a path that led by our chairman, and a path that would actually grow jobs and move us in a new direction. The challenge of what we had was, in the Senate, there was no budget. The last time since I've been here that the Senate produced a budget, the iPad wasn't introduced. But this House moved to no budget, no pay, and the Senate began to move. But they came up with a different number than we had had. And we had found a stalemate on the floor that the country was frustrated with, we were frustrated with, and we knew this was not the way Congress was designed. So with this agreement, it moves us in a much different place. Every year that Congress failed to pass a budget, it ceded its power, intended by our founders to be held by Congress, to the executive branch. As House Republicans continue to fight for more limited government that empowers the individuals and makes smarter spending decisions, the standards set by this agreement will be critically important. The budget agreement takes steps to reform mandatory spending that starts out slow but compounds over the years and results in arrear and growing spending reductions year over year. It also moves us closer to a more responsible entitlement reform that leads to a balanced budget, paying down our debt, and a sustainable economic future. Today is a unique day. Today is a day that's a step in the right direction, and it shows the common ground that not only this body, but the Senate can take as well. And I thank all those who are involved, and I ask for a yes vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to a terrific member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that the previous speaker forgot to mention the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, totaling $2.3 trillion. The war in Iraq was conveniently left out. The process of sequestration was ill-considered, and the result is all around us. Listen, I was happy to have it until I heard that the Republicans were responsible for all the good things that are in this, and the Democrats were only responsible for the revenue side. Revenue is at about 16% of gross domestic product right now. Those are the Eisenhower years. And we need to have this discussion. Now, let me say this as well. Mr. Ryan deserves to be credited, as does Mr. Van Hollen, with the measure that's in front of us today. But if we could get past some of the acrimony and the ill-considered language here, maybe we could find a path forward. The Medicare picture has brightened substantially. It's wild what's happened. The automobile sector is doing much better. The private sector in general is. Americans are shedding debt. But not to miss the point that there's a very elusive term that needs to be addressed in America today, and it's the term of confidence. The government shutdown shaved 1 to 2 points off of gross domestic product. That's reality. That's not fiction. We need to get past, again, the harsh language that has now taken over this institution and provide investors and provide the American people with the idea of some confidence to unleash the forces of that $2 trillion that's sitting here domestically and another $1 trillion that's sitting offshore. This is the sort of conversation that we need to have. This is a confidence-building measure. And it does lighten up some of the spending caps, again, that would have caused grave damage to the economy. We should have found the time to help out on the issue of unemployment benefits. Mr. Speaker, we did the doc fix this morning. I favored it. $8 billion over 3 months. We could have found money in this budget to extend unemployment benefits to the American family.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, there are a couple of other factors that I think members should weigh as we look at this legislation. Number one is if we do not pass this legislation, we face a fiscal impasse on January 15th and therefore a potential government shutdown at that time, and then we face a fiscal impact at the end of September and a possible government shutdown at that time. I don't know of anyone in this body that thinks these government shutdowns are productive or useful or helpful to our economy. And so by having this agreement in place, we prevent those two episodes from occurring and we prevent those two government shutdowns. Point number two, for too long, for 3 years, this body, Congress, the legislative branch, the one that the founders envisioned in the Constitution would be exercising the power of the purse, the branch of government that's the representative of the people that's supposed to decide how money is spent, well, we've been ceding that authority to the executive branch by passing what we call continuing resolutions. So the spending priorities that were set 3 years ago are still in place, and then we just keep writing these blank checks to the administration, and they set the priorities. That's not a partisan thing. This is an institutional thing. This is a separation of powers thing. Democrats and Republicans alike believe that we should do our jobs, that we should exercise the power of the purse, that the legislative branch should bring back its authority to do this. This does that by restarting the appropriations process, by agreeing to these numbers, which are bipartisan numbers, mutually agreed to numbers. By not doing continuing resolutions, we are reclaiming the power of the purse. I'll give myself another minute. There are those of us who are worried about regulations, who are worried about the exercise of power at the executive branch, who are worried about a sense of less accountability among the executive branch. We do lots of oversight hearings. We do dozens a week. But oversight pales in comparison when it doesn't have any fiscal force behind it. By reclaiming the power of the purse, by having Congress write the budgets and approve and decide the budgets of the executive agencies, that gives us a far stronger hand in affecting effective oversight, in conducting oversight. By using the power of the purse, along with effective oversight, we can do our jobs as the legislative branch in conducting oversight of the executive branch and setting priorities. My friends have their priorities and we have our priorities, and sometimes we meet, sometimes we don't. At least Congress gets to set the priorities on how the money sent to us from hardworking taxpayers is spent. That's one of the things that is accomplished in this agreement. That, along with all these other reasons, is why I really encourage all of our members to support this agreement. With that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to my friend, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues for arriving at a budget deal. When we asked our Democratic conferees to negotiate the best deal they could, we did it knowing that they were negotiating with colleagues whose priority is debt reduction, not jobs. Even though the federal government debt deficit is the smallest since 2008. Given the Republican priorities, they had a heavy task of partially lifting the sequester, protecting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and averting a shutdown. And so I think that's good. But there are parts of the deal that leave me very uncomfortable. I can't possibly imagine leaving this place, leaving all those Americans, over 1 million people, without any means of sustenance other than maybe their local food shelf. I mean, it's not humane, it's not right, and it's bad for the economy, because the people who got those unemployment insurance checks would be able to spend them with local vendors, which would actually help our economy. That's not going to happen unless something happens. I've heard estimates as high as 310,000 jobs could be lost if something isn't done. Also, the $6 billion cut for future federal employees' retirement. I'm very disturbed about that because we need good people working for the federal government. How can we attract the best people to work for this country if every time we got to solve a budget problem, we're going into their piggy bank? Jets and yachts, if we eliminated accelerated depreciation, we'd be 3/4 of the way there on these federal employees' retirement benefits, future employees. And so I'm deeply disappointed we did not look to close any loopholes, and that's a shame, so I remain disappointed.
The gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
I think I'll reserve it this time. I'm waiting for the leader. He's on his way.
The gentleman from Wisconsin reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I inquire as to how much time remains on each side?
The gentleman from Maryland has 12 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Wisconsin has 11½ minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentlelady from California, great member of the Armed Services Committee, Ms. Davis.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1½ minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have taken a first step to come together. Well, it's a bigger step than we have seen in a while, but let's remember, it is only a first step. And I think people have said a small step. But it is a step, and I'm as excited as some of you are saying that we have been able to do that. However, and more than that, unfortunately, we have not been able to come together to keep up the safety net for 1.3 million unemployed Americans by extending emergency unemployment insurance. And in fact, the problem of long-term unemployment is not even addressed. It wasn't even discussed at length. If you want to pull away the safety net and leave people with nothing, well, at least have some creative solutions for getting them back to work. Now, like many of you, I have to go back to my district. I have to go back to my constituents in San Diego who have been struggling to find work for so long and tell them that we could not come together to preserve their only means of subsistence. So let's remember, as we take this step forward, let us keep working together to extend unemployment benefits for those in desperate need and let us start coming up with some bigger solutions to getting people back to work. I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, a member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Rokita.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I thank him for his leadership, not only on this issue, but on so many of the bills and issues that come before this Congress. And I also thank the leadership on the other side of the Budget Committee and the other side of this Congress for their leadership in coming together as well. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this bipartisan budget legislation. As you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm one of the folks around here who's considered by some maybe affectionately, some by others not so affectionately, as a budget hawk. I came to reduce our spending and get as much value for every dollar we take from the taxpayer, and more increasingly from the children of tomorrow, from those who don't exist, who we're taxing through by running up our debt. So I watch these issues closely. I'm actively, in my opinion, engaged in them. And I want to say on this House floor that this budget is a better deal than the current sequestration law because it makes spending reforms beyond sequestration that will continue on after sequestration expires. The reforms and therefore the budget savings start immediately and compound over time. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, I'm not talking about trading real sequester savings for magic beans. These are reforms that will start once this bill passes and once the President signs it. And again, will compound over time. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we're starting to open the door and address what is actually causing our deficits and debt, and that is our entitlement programs. And so I applaud again the chairman of the Budget Committee. I applaud the ranking member and others in the Senate who are supporting this measure, because we're finally able to get to discuss and solve what is the major problem that this country is facing at this time. And like the others who have spoken, I look forward to having more of these discussions and getting on to the business of solving what is creating so much problem in this country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, if I could ask the chairman of the Budget Committee whether he has any other speakers at this time.
More. Do you want?
Okay. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves his time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield a minute to our distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Kenner.
The gentleman from Virginia, the Majority Leader, is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin, the Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. Mr. Speaker, in a divided government, the American people expect members of both parties to come together and find common ground to move America forward. While this budget agreement is not perfect, it is a step forward towards bridging our differences and bringing fiscal responsibility to Washington. The legislation before the House today will reduce our deficit, it will make long-term pension reforms, and it will do so without raising taxes on the hard-working middle-class families of our country. This budget deal also protects our national security at home and around the world by preventing dramatic cuts to our national defense as a result of the sequester. Mr. Speaker, I think we can all agree that arbitrary, indiscriminate, across-the-board spending cuts are not the smartest way to cut spending. Last year, House Republicans passed 2 bills that would have replaced the sequester's indiscriminate across-the-board cuts. This bill before us is a reflection of our priority to replace the sequester with permanent savings that will responsibly reduce our deficit. This legislation will allow Congress to concentrate on appropriating taxpayer funds to our country's highest priorities. Let's stand together and show the American people that we are focused on reining in Washington's out-of-control spending habits while growing our economy. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Wisconsin, the chairman of the Budget Committee, Mr. Ryan, for his perseverance and his quest to rein in the wasteful spending, to work towards balancing our budget. I want to thank him for his tenacity in the negotiations that he had with Senator Murray to arriving at this deal. I want to thank him and his entire committee for their hard work. This is a bipartisan budget agreement, one that has not been frequently seen in terms of bipartisan agreement on this floor, and I urge my colleagues in the House to support this agreement. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to just emphasize a point that we've both made, which is that if we had our druthers, we would have approached this issue differently. And I do want to say, with respect to some of the offsets, there are many of us who would have preferred to see the closures of many special interest tax breaks as part of the offsets in this legislation. We hope that as we go forward, we would agree that that's also a kind of wasteful spending in the tax code. If you give a special interest in this country some tax preference not enjoyed by others, you're simply raising the burden on everybody else. It's simply a form of spending through the tax code. So, Mr. Speaker, as we address these issues going forward, whether it's replacing the sequester or reducing the deficit, as part of a balanced approach, we think we should take those into account as well. We also propose, as part of this measure, applying some of the excessive subsidies that we give to agribusinesses as part of the offsets, and our colleagues rejected those. So, as has been said, this is a product of compromise, but I do want to let people know that it has been our preference to close some of those special interest tax breaks and use some of those excessive agriculture subsidies as offsets here rather than some of the provisions that are before us. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Maryland reserves his time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House.
The gentleman from Ohio, the Speaker of the House, is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, let me thank Chairman Ryan and his Senate counterparts and
Democrats and Republicans, frankly, on both sides of the Capitol, who worked hard to bring this agreement together. My colleagues, I think it's pretty simple. If you're for reducing the budget deficit, then you should be voting for this bill. If you're for cutting the size of government, you should be supporting this budget. If you're for preventing tax increases, you should be voting for this budget. If you're for entitlement reform, you ought to be voting for this budget. These are the things I came here to do, and this budget does them. Is it perfect? Does it go far enough? No, not at all. I think it's going to take a lot more work to get our arms around our debt and our deficit. But this budget is a positive step in that direction. It's progress. It's doing what the American people expect us to do. It's coming together and finding common ground. Stick to our principles, but find common ground. And so again, I commend Chairman Ryan and Chairman Murray for their work, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote for this budget.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the chairman of the Budget Committee have any other speakers? I'm sorry? I do. Yeah, we're waiting for Mr. Hoyer to arrive, so if I could reserve the balance of my time.
All right.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves his time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
At this time, I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Chairman Ryan for his great leadership in forging this particular agreement and putting us in a position to end on a positive note here as we approach the Christmas and the holiday season. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to bring a couple of different perspectives to the floor as I analyze this budget deal. The first perspective I have is that of being a former mayor for 12 years in a great city in northwest Arkansas where there was an enormous amount of economic development and we did a lot of great things. I sat at the table many, many times talking about issues and trying to balance the needs of our community against what the wants of our community were. And I got to tell you that I never, ever ended any of those negotiations getting everything that I wanted. But I always looked for an opportunity to find the common ground and to advance the economic development issues of our city where we could find that type of consensus. Mr. Speaker, I also bring the perspective of an appropriator. As somebody who came to Congress in 2011, was immediately assigned to the Appropriations Committee, and quite frankly, I've been frustrated through this entire process, living from CR to CR, and never, ever having the opportunity to do what appropriators are purposed in doing. And this agreement, while not perfect, as has already been mentioned by most every speaker, gives us an opportunity to take government shutdowns off the table, to restore some much-needed funding to something very important to all of us, and that's our national defense, but as an appropriator gives us an opportunity to actually do our jobs and quit ceding the authority for the power of the purse to the administration down the street. So from that perspective, Mr. Speaker, I think this is the right deal at the right time, gives us an opportunity to give some certainty to the American public who's looking to this Congress to be able to work together to try to find the solutions that move America forward. And with that, I urge support, and I yield back my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland. Gentleman from Maryland.
I'm sorry, I was looking at my colleague and friend from the state of Maryland, Mr. Hoyer. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 4 minutes to our distinguished whip and somebody who's been working very hard on these budget issues and working with us also to make sure that this is done in as fair and equitable manner as possible, and worked with us very closely to make sure that federal employees do not take a disproportionate share of the burden, and as a result of our efforts, current federal employees will not be asked to bear additional burdens after having already borne so much of the burden. With that, I yield 4 minutes to my friend, Mr. Hoyer.
I thank the gentleman.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes after the first gentleman from Maryland yielded him 4 minutes.
The gentlemen from Maryland are happy to be here with you, Mr. Speaker. We want you to know that.
I'm ecstatic, too.
All right. I knew you would be. First of all, let me say that America is advantaged by having two people who work on the Budget Committee who have great intellect, great integrity, and care about America. Mr. Ryan from Wisconsin and Mr. Van Hollen from Maryland. The American public sometimes is not sure that it has the kind of quality that if they were here sitting in the Budget Committee or on the floor and listening to these two gentlemen who have disagreements, but who represent their positions well. Mr. Speaker, I voted for every budget compromise that has been passed over the past 3 years, without fail. The results, however, invariably have been an unremitting undermining of our efforts to reach a balanced fiscal policy and to invest in that which will secure our future: the economy, education, infrastructure, national security, and innovation. And while each of those bills was preferable to default on our debt or the shutting down of our government, they have been simply stopgap measures that have not prevented continuing lurches from congressionally created and all too frequent fiscal crisis and shutdowns. The headlines regarding this agreement put it in perspective. An op-ed in the New York Times says, quote, "Congress avoids reality again," close quote. The Wall Street Journal calls it the least bad budget deal. And while a USA Today headline says, "Minimalist budget deal beats another shutdown," the editorial concludes with this, however, quote, "Unless we come to grips with the fiscal issue, we will be inflicting a huge financial burden on our children." I agree. The deal before us today does not deal with the fundamental issue of long-term fiscal stability. My friend Mr. Ryan says he wants to do that. My friend Mr. Van Hollen says he wants to do that. I think Senator Murray wants to do that. We have not done that. We have not dealt with the underlying issues that prevent us from being a fiscally sustainable path. It does not replace the full sequester, which Chairman Hal Rogers, who I know has spoken in favor of this agreement, has correctly described as ill-advised and unrealistic. I said on this floor when we considered the gentleman's budget that if there were no Democrats in the House of Representatives, they could not implement that budget. I believe that. I believe it because the figures were not related to priorities or vision or that which we needed to accomplish as a country, but on a number, 967. That's an opinion shared by all of the Republican Appropriations Subcommittee chairmen and wrote a letter to that effect. Nor critically does this agreement deal with the issue of the debt limit, which will confront us shortly, and which has historically over the last 3 years been an inflection point to further reduce not only discretionary spending on both sides, mainly on the non-defense side, but also to reach once again into the pockets of federal employees. Now, I'm someone who represents 62,000 federal employees, and I recommended zero COLAs. The first 2 years we did zero COLAs. Why? The economy was in trouble, and it was necessary for federal employees, like everybody else, to participate. I better be quick. If we fail to resolve this issue now, it will simply plunge us into another manufactured crisis, which will quickly undermine the stability and confidence that some believe this agreement is bringing.